Good morning, everyone, and welcome again to our channel. For me, it's a pleasure to receive you today, and we stay with Professor Federico Travan from Italy, Milena Salatino, and also our invitation, Professor Andrea De Guttri. For me, it's a pleasure and an honor to receive Professor De Guttri, that is an important professor of international law in Italy, and he developed an important research about catastrophe. And we developed here in Brazil, in our research group, Lepadia, this subject about risk, catastrophe, and international law. So for us, it's a pleasure to receive an important professor to speak to us about this important subject. I am Sidney Guerra. I am full professor of international law at Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and also I am the coordinator of Lepadia. And it's a great pleasure to open this section and to welcome such a distinguished audience. We are gathered here today to reflect upon a topic that lies at the intersection of international law, global risk governance, and contemporary security challenges. In an increasingly interconnected world, the nature of treaties has evolved in both scale and complexity, requiring us to rethink traditional legal frameworks and institutional response. Chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear events, often referred to as CB or N risks, exemplify this transformation. They are not confined by borders, nor can they be fully addressed through isolated or sectoral approach. Instead, they demand coordinated, anticipatory, and multidisciplinary response capable of integration, prevention, preparedness, and response within a current legal framework. In this context, the idea of an all-hazard approach becomes particularly relevant. It reflects a shift from fragmented and reactive models toward a more comprehensive understanding of risk, one that acknowledges the interdependence of different types of threats and the necessity of the integrated governance mechanisms. From the perspective of international law, this raises fundamental question. Are our existing legal frameworks adequate to deal with such complex and evolving risks? How can we ensure effective cooperation among states and international organizations? And how can we move from a logic of reaction to a logic of anticipation? These questions are especially important when we consider that many of these risks are closely linked to broader global challenges, including environmental, degradation, technological development, and structural inequalities. In this sense, what we often describe as catastrophes are not merely sudden events, but rather the result of cumulative processes that expose vulnerabilities within our legal and institutional systems. It's therefore a great honor to welcome Professor Andrea De Guttri, whose work offers an important contribution to this debate, particularly through his reflection on international law and CBRN events. I'm certain that this section will provide valuable insights and stimulate further reflection on how international law can evolve to better address the complex risks of our time. So as I said to you and everybody, I'm very happy to receive in the first time Professor De Guttry, an important professor from Italy, in our first activity that we are planning to cooperate with together, our universities. And today, I'd like to invite Ms. Milena Salatino to take the stage to present Professor De Guttry. Milena Salatino worked with me in Master of Law, and it's a pleasure, Milena, to receive you again. Welcome.
Thank you, Professor Sidney. Good morning, everyone here in Brazil. Good evening or good afternoon to those who are watching us from Italy. It is a great pleasure to welcome you to this event, which counts with the participation of our speaker, the esteemed Professor Andrea De Guttry, and also Professor Sidney Guerra, full professor at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, as well as Dr. Federico Travan, Doctor in International Law by the University of Rome, La Sapienza, and also postdoctoral researcher in International Law at the University of Geneva. Professor, it is now my great honor to introduce our speaker. Professor Andrea De Guttry is an Emeritus Professor of Public International Law at the Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna in Pisa, Italy. He has an extensive academic and professional career, including serving in key legal positions within the Italian government and acting as Deputy Director at Sant'Anna School. Professor De Guttry has coordinated numerous international research and training projects in collaboration with institutions such as the United Nations, the European Union, and other international organizations working across different regions of the world. He's the author of more than 100 publications in the field of international law, including the recent volume International Law and Chemical, Biological, Radionuclear Events Towards a No Hazard Approach. It is truly a privilege to have him with us today. Professor De Guttry, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Professor Guerra, it is a great honor and pleasure for me to be here today. Thank you very much for the invitation. And from our side, we confirm our interest in reinforcing the bilateral cooperation in between our two universities. As you may know, we are very open-minded and we are always looking for additional partners in different projects we are carrying out. So thank you very much once again for your invitation. Thank you very much, Milena, for the very kind words you had. It's my great pleasure really to address you and to focus on one minor challenge which we are facing, minor compared to the many challenges Professor Guerra has identified earlier, which are now affecting the international legal community because we are becoming popular and unpopular, but the problems remain there. And I think that they deserve to be carefully examined and to find new ideas on how to overcome a certain number of problems. Let me just start, if it's possible to display the PowerPoint, let me just start saying why I started to focus the attention on CBRN, which might sound a little bit strange for an international lawyer. As it has been anticipated by Milena, I have been working and I've been editing several years ago the first book on international disaster response law, in which we have been trying to address all possible challenges or identify which are the legal challenges the international community is facing in dealing with disaster. I realized at that moment that the international community and member states of the international community are eager to stipulate new international conventions regulating specific aspects of potential disaster and how to better cooperate. And one of the areas in which there have been quite a lot of international agreements for reinforcing the cooperation among the different states in the different region or at universal level, one of these areas is CBRN. So what I tried to do a couple of years ago, together with my colleagues of the University of Florence, Bologna, and Turin, we decided to write a book identifying which are precisely the obligations incumbent on states related to CBRN events. Be them malicious, so an explosion or something done by a human being, or simply due to natural disaster. When we started, we had the feeling that states are interested in stipulating conventions, that these conventions regulate in a very detailed manner what states have to do in conformity with these obligations, but we had a little bit the perception that states were not so good in implementing these obligations at national level. And therefore, what we decided to do is, first of all, let's identify which are these obligations incumbent on states related to CBRN events. And this is the book, which you may get the link, which it is an open source book, so everybody can has easily free of charge access. But in a second moment, we focus the attention as well on what states have done to implement these obligations which are incumbent. And I anticipate, and this will be a little bit as well the conclusion of my presentation, that unfortunately, although there are many sources regulating what we have to do to prevent, prepare, deal, recover after a CBRN event, the implementation of these obligations is far from ideal, and we see why this happens and what could be done. But to me, to be even more precise, as the topic is huge, I decided to focus my attention specifically on the so-called preparedness obligation. And preparedness obligation, that is to say, assuming that it is almost impossible to 100% prevent a CBRN event, I repeat, both man-made or caused by a natural disaster, what have the state to do to be better prepared to deal with such a dangerous situation? Which are the measures states have to adopt to mitigate the risks of something which we have to try to prevent, but unfortunately, it's not always possible to prevent. And in this frame, I would like to present you which are the learning outcomes of my presentation, which hopefully will last about 40 minutes or 45 minutes. And at the end of my presentation, I hope that you will be more aware about the multitude of international sources dealing with CBRN events at different levels: universal, regional, bilateral level, and regulating both man-made and natural CBRN events. The second goal is that you are better equipped to understand and to be aware about the content of these obligations. So there are many treaties. We will then focus attention on what do these treaties tell us, which are the obligations states have accepted to implement in the moment they have decided to ratify the treaty and the treaty entered into force. The third part I would like you to be more aware is to understand the current challenges in the implementation of these preparedness obligations at national level. Why this is not working as it should be working, and how much this failure to implement the obligation, which are binding because states accepted these obligations in the moment they ratified international conventions. So why does this happen, that they are not so able to implement them fully, and which are the consequences, especially on the questions of human rights? Now, as far as the content of my presentation is concerned, you see that I would like to start with a few introductory and remarks and terminological clarifications. What do we understand under CBRN? What do we understand under preparedness? And then a few data on how likely is it that there might be in the coming future CBRN events? So how many CBRN events occurred, for example, last year? Just to give you an idea that this is not a theoretical problem, it is a very practical, a very concrete, a very real problem, because you will see from the data we'll provide you, CBRN events happen, unfortunately, every year, and the consequences might be terrible. In the second part, I will quickly identify which are the sources regulating these preparedness obligations incumbent on states. I then will pay the attention on the content. And lastly, I will try to identify which are the current challenges in the implementation of these international obligations. So let's start with a very short introductory remarks. I think that everybody is pretty well aware, and Professor Guerra in his introduction made it even more clear, that CBRN incidents, both stemming from natural disaster or from man-made activities, have become a major concern for policymakers worldwide, and are really a series, provoke a big attention, request a big attention by staff, which at national level is supposed to be ready to face the consequences. And the people, policymaker and operational staff are worried about potential CBR events because they might have incredibly long-term social and economic consequences, and therefore it is of crucial importance to adopt as much as possible all the measures to mitigate the potential consequences of a CBRN events. I think it is very clear that CBRN events are a powerful fear multiplier, amplifying the psychological impact of them. And you probably have noticed that this continuous reference, both during the Ukraine war, the aggression of Russia versus Ukraine, or in the current war against Iran, one of the key aspects is precisely the question of regulating CBRN events and not allowing one or the other part to be able to use these tools, which might have terrible consequences. While these events that do not happen every day, luckily enough, but they are rapidly evolving due to a series of reasons, for example, the increased geopolitical tensions, the technological evolution, the more and more active role played by non-state actors who are becoming able to make use of CBRN tools for negative activities. And all this demands sustained vigilance, preparedness, prevention, and strategic risk management. Without wishing to create some additional fear, but I have to mention that in 2021, the United Kingdom government warned that a successful terrorist CBRN attack is likely to occur by 2030. So in the next 3 years, 4 years calculating from now. This is the UK government, and this is not the only government who is considering this as a likely event. Having said this, and therefore having said that this event happens, and I will show you in a few moments a little bit more details about how many events happened last year, and the consequences of this event might be terrible. Let me just move now to some kind of terminological clarifications, because we are speaking of CBRN activities, and you see here you have I don't now read them because in any case you will get, for those of you interested, you will get a copy of my presentation, but includes chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear material. And you see that chemical agents are divided into various subcategories, from nerve agents to blister agents to cyanides to choking pulmonary agents, biological life agents such as bacteria, including chlamydia, viruses, and fungi are extremely dangerous. Radiological are all those related to material with some kind of potential of radiation, and then you see obviously the nuclear material. Here you have a quick list. There will be 3 slides. I don't enter into the details, but it is simply to prove what I've been mentioning before. CBRN events are happening. Luckily enough, so far with last year with minor impacts, but if they are not managed in a proper manner, they might have terrible consequences. Here you have a list of events which happened last year with the location of the country, the kinds of incident which happened, the impact, and then some kind of notes. And you see, for example, as far as chemical activities are concerned, there has been a major leak in a fertilizer plant in Southeast Asia, minor injuries, evacuation of local staff. This has been a so-called accidental industrial release. Something similar in North America, hazardous chemical transport accident on a highway. The consequences were basically that they had to close the road. There have been no significant consequences for the local population. Here you have 2 events which occurred in 2025 in Europe, a small-scale chlorine leak. In Europe, this once more is an industrial incident, a biological incident, a laboratory contamination with non-pathogenic bacteria. Luckily enough, there was no public exposure, but they had to reinforce the biosecurity area of the research lab. And then another biological incident in Asia, the spill of the laboratory pathogen sample, as well, no major problems, luckily enough. And finally, the 2 events which are the most recent one, although they were already there in 2025, the accusation, which was a reciprocal accusation by Ukraine and Russia to be using CBRN arms, which to a large extent are prohibited by existing international conventions in the war. And something similar happened in the war in the Middle East, in which both Israel has been accused of having used chemical weapons, and although Israel always rejected this accusation, and Israel as well accused the counterpart to having used similar kinds of arms during the Gaza war. Finally, let me just now briefly focus the attention on what do we understand under preparedness, because what we are looking is to identify which are these preparedness obligations incumbent on states. And here you see a report of 2010 of the UN General Assembly. It's 2016, beg your pardon. It sounds a bit old, but this is one of the most detailed definition, and we see that preparedness has been defined as the knowledge and capacities developed by governments, response and recovery organizations, communities, and individuals to effectively anticipate, respond to, and recover from the impacts of likely, imminent, or current disasters. I think that already from this very preliminary definition, and you see where I took it, what emerges is that inevitably an event, a CBRN event, involves a wide range of activities to be carried out by different actors, which are not only states. Today we will focus on states' obligations, but there are quite a lot of other actors which are directly involved in preparing or preventing CBRN events. International organizations, they play a significant role. Individuals, civil society, local communities, and public agencies. So to deal in a proper manner with the preparedness obligations to be ready to mitigate the risk of CBRN events, we must always be aware that we need the strong cooperation and dialogue among different actors. Each of them plays a significant role, starting from states, but not excluding other important actors. Now, preparedness is something slightly different from prevention. The prevention means that we have to do whatever we can do to try to prevent this event of happening. And therefore, states have an obligation, according to this definition, to whatever is reasonably possible or necessary to prevent a given event from occurring, but there is no guarantees that this event will not occur. And therefore, as it might happen that you are not able to prevent, for example, an earthquake, you can do what you can create a certain number of tools to guarantee that there is a pre-alerting system, but there is no guarantee that the earthquake will not happen. You cannot prevent it. But and in such a case, preparedness becomes essential because the assumption is that it will happen. Although you have adopted many preventive measures, it will happen, and therefore you have to try to reduce or to mitigate the risks. Now, this obligation of prevention, I repeat, we are not focusing on this, but just that you have a clearer picture, is usually linked to the concept of due diligence, which was developed specifically by international jurisprudence after 1950 with the new potential threats generated by highly dangerous activities, which requested to have new standards of care. Now, let me move to the second part of my presentation, namely, which are the sources regulating these preparedness obligations. I'm quoting here the International Law Commission, and specifically a sentence from the report of the ILC on the protection of persons in events of disaster. Now, according to this report, and you know which is the status of this report, so it's not a binding document, but it reflects to a certain extent the opinion not only of the major expert of the International Law Commission, but as well of many states who have approved the report. According to this report, each state shall reduce the risk of disasters by taking appropriate measures, including through legislation regulation, to prevent, mitigate, and prepare for disaster. So this is a very general rule identified by the International Law Commission, which says, state, you must act to prevent, mitigate, and you must act to be ready to mitigate the consequences of a disaster. And what is interesting, the International Law Commission also identifies the sources of these obligations, which are the principles emanating from international human rights law, first of all, and from a number of international environmental law principles, including the due diligence principle. And according to the International Law Commission, this rule is based on a widespread practice of states reflecting their commitment to reduce the risk of disaster. It translated into more simple words, according to the International Law Commission, we are in the presence of an international customary law, which is inevitably binding on every state of the international community as such. But we will see in the next slides that there have been the also quite a lot of treaties trying to get a little bit more into the details of these more general and customary law obligations incumbent on states to be ready to deal with CBRN disaster and disaster in general. If you look to the codification of these principles, because so far the International Law Commission was speaking more of a customary law rule, the codification of this principle, there have been attempts in about 100 years ago when, as a few of you might remember, there has been an attempt to establish the so-called International Relief Union in 1926, so pretty much 100 years ago. It did, as you know, this convention did not succeed. But at that moment, so already 100 years ago, there was a first attempt to codify this principle that states have an obligation to mitigate and to be prepared to deal with major disaster. After this negative experience, what happened, and this is quite interesting, the situation changed and the attitude changed. And instead of having one general rule in a treaty, we noticed that there are many preparedness obligations in several treaties regulating specific typologies of disaster or issues related to the management of disaster. So the negative aspect is that we cannot make reference to one precise rule which is codified in a universal treaty stating exactly which is this obligation incumbent on states related to preparedness. But the advantage is that we have this notion of preparedness, which has already been identified by an international commission, more precisely defined in a significant number of international treaties dealing with specific aspects of international disaster or specific typologies of international disasters. Now, here you have a list. It is very tentative, just that you have an idea that I am telling you the truth when I say that there are many treaties containing a reference to these preparedness obligations. You see treaties on very different topics, many of them directly related to disaster, others which are not directly, but they regulate partially as well the consequences of a disaster or what has to happen in the presence of a disaster. These are most universal convention. I repeat, it's not a full list, it is just a few samples so that you have an idea of how many of these sources are available. I would like to remember that besides the universal level, we have a significant number of regional sources. In Europe, if I may start, as I am speaking to you from Italy, we have plenty of EU regulation regulating these specific aspects of preparedness for CBRN events or for, in general, major disaster. But similar rules, may be drafted in a slightly different manner, more evolved or less evolved, are present as well in regional organizations such as Africa Union, or in specific case of Latin America, in the Organization of American States, have focused quite a lot on preparedness, although especially in the first moment, preparedness was understood mostly as cooperation, as organizing the international cooperation should an event, a disaster, be it CBRN or not, happen. As you know better than me, there is a 1991 Inter-American Convention to facilitate disaster assistance, which has been ratified by a very limited number of states, but this has influenced as well the subsequent practice, and this specific convention contains quite a lot of relevant rules, better clarifying which are the obligations incumbent on states of the American regions dealing with the management of disasters. This was reinforced as well during the 2001 Third Summit of the Americans, in which they has been clearly clarified, the obligation states have. And please do not forget that besides universal and regional level, there are quite a lot of interesting sources regulating the preparedness obligations, which have been codified in sub-regional agreements, such as in the Caribbean region, in Central and in Central American region. Last but not least, there are not only hard law sources, but there are quite a lot of soft law international sources regulating the question of preparedness to CBRN events. Here you have a few samples of this soft law. I'm sure that you are pretty aware that soft law is non-binding, obviously, but it is extremely important because it helps you to understand in which direction the international community is moving. Very often, soft law transforms at a later moment into hard law, or soft law sometimes supports the interpretation of a hard law, of a convention, and therefore it is extremely important for those who have specific interest in this area to be aware about the soft law sources regulating preparedness obligations. Now, let me go to the third part, and then with the fourth part, I conclude my presentation. The third part is devoted to present you a little bit which is the content of this preparedness obligation. We have seen that customary law foresees that states have preparedness obligation. Many treaty, universal, regional, sub-regional, try to be more specific. What I'm doing now in the next slides is to give you examples of the content of these obligations related to preparedness codified in the different sources we have mentioned earlier. One example is that member states have an obligation to collect, first of all, and then to share accurate data. Now, it might seem a little bit surprising to see this among the preparedness obligations, but what recent events, and I'm not referring only with COVID, but as well with other similar situations, proved is that it is of crucial importance to have as accurate data as possible, disaggregated, especially taking into consideration as well vulnerable groups, because this is the key element which helps to decide which is the best measure to be adopted in the short time to try to mitigate the consequences. The second content of many of these rules is the question of the early warning systems, which according to many of these rules need to be reinforced. Now we have the technology, we have artificial intelligence, we have a lot of tools which should be used more to warn you, to wake up the international community, states, about possible consequences of events which are occurring in their states or in bordering states. The third element is related to promoting the resilience of critical infrastructures, including water, transportation, telecommunication. I think that this is something which has been observed in several times. It is capturing more and more the attention. How should we organize the critical infrastructures to be ready in cases of major CBRN attacks? And this is becoming an area of great attention of the international community, because obviously if we are not ready to protect the critical infrastructure, any CBRN event might provoke even worse consequences. Beg your pardon. Another obligation which emerges from the many sources I quoted earlier is the obligation to prepare preparedness plan at national or at regional level, which have to clearly state what happens if, who is in charge, who has to act, which is the role of the different parties involved, the different stakeholders involved in managing a disaster. It seems quite obvious, But if you look, and we will see this in a couple of minutes when I'm going to my final consideration, it is not very popular among member states of the international community to have such preparedness plans, which in my opinion are really a basic tool to make sure that preparedness measures will work in a proper manner. Other obligations are related to the health system, very popular during the COVID. And this means that states must guarantee that they have a properly functioning health system, which is ready for normal situation, but it must be ready as well to deal with major consequences of potential CBRN events. And this includes as well the question of the stockpiling of emergency relief items. During COVID, we realized how not well we are organized in providing the necessary tools for mitigating the risk of COVID among the population. Another issue is the question of improving the cooperation among relevant UN bodies and other international actors to make sure that we maximize the effect of this cooperation. Furthermore, it is requested that states organize on a regular basis training activities and exercises to make sure that those involved in dealing with a CBRN event know exactly what to do should an event happen. In this regard, I have to say, and I am proud being an Italian citizen, that especially in Europe, the European Union is investing huge amounts of money to favor the training of the staff involved in potential CBRN measures, but not only training, they are generously financing as well exercising in which they simulate CBRN event and to see how the different actors at local, national, and regional level will interact. But as well, the European Union has been generously financing quite a lot of new tools which help to deal in a proper manner in the mitigation of these kind of risks. Furthermore, another obligation is to make sure that there is a proper information flow, which is not only among the different stakeholders, but it is as well vis-à-vis the local population, which is a critical point about this. Okay, now let's move to the last part of my presentation, namely which are the current challenges in implementing the measures. We have seen the sources, we have seen the content of the obligations, of the key obligations incumbent of states. Now, are the states doing what they have decided that they should do based on the treaties they have ratified or not? I have already anticipated that, unfortunately, the answer is not as positive as we would like it to be. And the reason is that to implement all these obligations, it is a quite ambitious work to be carried out, and it has significant costs associated with significant costs. So you cannot implement all the obligations I tried to summarize just a few seconds ago if you do not have enough time, enough human resources, and enough financial resources. This is a major problem, and as I have anticipated, only a limited number of states have really taken these obligations seriously, and they have done what they are supposed to do, and therefore they have adopted manuals, they are training their staff, they are preparing all the devices which are necessary to a quick reaction, all those measures which are typically requested during a CBRN event. But most of the states, unfortunately, have not been very active, and the justification which has been used by them usually is we don't have money. And to implement all these preparedness measures means that you need to have enough resources. Now, if this argument can be understood, I don't say accepted, but understood, especially in countries with major financial limitations, I don't think that it is a credible argument for states who do not suffer major financial limitations. And as you see in the slide, it has been calculated by a very credible research team that to finance preparedness measures, which I repeat, can be used in the case of CBRN event, but can be used as well in the case of any other natural or man-made disaster. So it's not only, you don't invest only for CBRN events, feeling that they are not likely to occur, but investing in preparedness means that you invest as well in mitigating the measures of any kind of natural disaster. I was saying that according to a very well-known research team, the cost for implementing these preparedness measures would be around $1 per person per year, which is a limited amount. I mean, it's quite a lot of money, obviously, but it is a very limited amount of money compared to the cost of not investing in this. The other argument which has been used is that states are sometimes not so convinced that the CBR event is likely to happen. I repeat, according to the UK, it is likely to happen a terrorist event. And I showed you that CBR event happen, mostly natural disaster or man-made disaster happen notwithstanding all the preventive measures we adopt. But states continue to think that this is not the major priority. Now, this dilemma of feeling that this is not a priority and therefore we have to spend our money on other priorities has been dealt with in a well-known European Court of Human Rights judgment, in which the court stated that an impossible or disproportionate burden must not be imposed on the authorities without consideration being given, in particular to operational choices which they must make in terms of priority and resources. In other words, there have been quite a lot of cases, especially in Europe, in which someone was accusing the state not having implemented preparedness measures, and the reaction of the state was, sorry, but we do not have enough money. So they went to the court, and the court says, okay, states do not have unlimited resources. They have to prioritize where they spend the money. But the court made it very clear that states are not 100% free to decide how to take the decisions, but the decisions have to be taken according to scientific data. They must be credible. They must be according to international standards. So if you decide not to invest in preparedness for a CBRN event, you need, in the case the issue should be brought in front of an international court to prove that you had enough credible scientific data which prove that it is very unlikely that the CBRN event happens in your territory, and therefore you gave preference to investing the limited amount of money available in other typologies of a disaster. So the court in any case keeps the right to check if this discretionary power by states has been carried out in a manner which is consistent with international standards. These sentences are based as well on the so-called margin of appreciation, which is a concept very much developed, especially, but not only, by the European Court on Human Rights, but it is applicable as well in many other. It has been used as well by many other international regional courts, according to which states have a certain margin of appreciation in deciding what to do and or where to invest, but the decisions on which these are taken must be credible, sound, based on scientific data, and the court always keeps the right, if the court is requested to do so, to check whether states have fulfilled this criteria to make sure that they have used the margin of appreciation in a proper manner. Now, I anticipated that one of the key problems which has been raised by many states is the scarcity of financial resources. Please be aware that there are quite a lot of interesting examples of activities carried out by different actors to try to find and support states who like to invest more in preparedness but do not have enough money. So you see, for example, the initiative of the World Bank through the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery. This is basically offering financial support to vulnerable states who have major financial constraints to make sure that they too can adopt preparedness plan to be ready to deal with a major natural man-made disaster or obviously as well CBRN event. In this framework, let me as well remember that the EU is one of the very important international partners who has developed a lot of international projects aimed to support states in fulfilling or implementing their preparedness obligations, especially in the CBRN area. I'm sure that you're aware that the European Union has significantly offered significant financial contribution to many states who were willing to work on preparedness, who wanted to be more ready to manage CBRN event, but did not have the financial support to do this. So to try to sum up, I think that unfortunately, most of the preparedness obligations, which we have summarized in a couple of minutes ago, are not implemented. And the lack of implementation represents a serious problem because should an event happen, especially a CBRN event, the consequences might be really a disaster and affecting significantly basic human rights. So we need to find solution, or state need to find a solution on how to be more consistent between what they committed themselves to do through ratification of international conventions and what they do. I think that one of the key differences with other areas of international law, for example, human rights, where the implementation of human rights is a key element, in the area of preparedness for natural disaster and especially for CBRN events, there are no monitoring mechanism. So these conventions state a lot of wonderful obligations which states have to implement, but then there is no mechanism, credible mechanism to monitor if states are really doing what they committed themselves to do. And therefore, my recommendation would be to invite, if should there be future treaties or even for the current treaties, to have a more credible monitoring system on the implementation of the obligations emerging from the different international conventions. In the meantime, my recommendation would be, as we cannot achieve all the preparedness obligation from one day to the other, to try to have some kind of planning which states have to prepare on how they are going to address the preparedness obligations in the coming years. So nobody's requesting you from today to tomorrow to be perfectly consistent with the obligations you have decided to accept, but at least present a plan according to which within 2, 3, 4, 5 years, you try to address one after the other the different implementation activities you have to carry out. Here I repeat the importance of having some kind of more credible monitoring mechanism. We see in these obligations related to preparedness for international disaster, because at the end of the day, what I feel is that otherwise this would be the consequences of CBRN event would be dramatic, especially for the human beings which are living in the area affected by a CBRN event, be it natural or man-made. And this is one of the reasons why I think states should do a little bit more in implementing their obligations. Let me finish now, which are my conclusions. I think that preparedness obligations are codified in a proper manner in several universal, regional, and sub-regional treaties. Obviously, the more you have, the better it is. But in this very moment, I do not feel that we lack clear indication of what states have to do. There are enough conventions. They have been ratified by states at universal and at regional level. The question is that we have to put more importance now on monitoring the implementation of these activities, of these obligations by the states. To do this, I think a more reinforced cooperation among different states would be very helpful. I can bring you the experience of the European Union, in which the position is we all member states of the European Union, we are aware that should a CBRN event happen in our territories, no one of us is able to manage and to be prepared by themselves. So what we did is we have tried to reinforce the mutual cooperation. Every state is doing something and is ready to support the state suffering a major CBRN event, be it natural or man-made. I think that this is the right approach, because this helps as well to save money, and it helps to give a little bit the idea that alone we are not able to face the potential consequences of a CBRN event. And therefore as well reinforcing the role of the United Nations in this area of improving cooperation would be very important. Finally, I think that we have to focus more the attention to create additional synergies among the different actors and to create this monitoring mechanism on how they are states are implementing these obligations. And this will be my last word. I think that further delays in the implementation of these obligations related to preparedness for CBRN event, but more generally for natural or man-made disaster, are not acceptable anymore, considering the significant impact they would have on protection of human rights. And I think that this should be always a key notion to be taken in a proper consideration when examining all this issue of preparedness obligation. Having said this, I would like to thank you for your attention, and obviously I remain available for any questions you might have or comments you might have. The floor is back to you.
Thank you, Professor, for this extremely insightful and thought-provoking presentation. Your analysis certainly highlighted the complexity of CBRN events and also the challenges that they pose to international law, particularly in terms of preparedness and coordination and response. Now I would like to call Dr. Travan, Federico Travan. Federico, would you like to share any reflections or comments in regards to our speaker's presentation?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Milena. Good morning or good afternoon to everyone. It is a great pleasure for me to be here today to discuss this important topic with you all. Let me first warmly thank you, Professor Sidney Guerra, with whom I have been working over the last few months on various projects. And I joined Lepadia, and I'm having the opportunity to learn a lot about international environmental law, international disaster law. We are also developing several initiatives with the Instituto Interamericano de Direitos Humanos, Ambiente e Sustentabilidade, which he recently founded. And so we share the common goal of building bridges between Brazil and Europe to enhance the protection of fundamental rights in our countries and societies. And we are not just linked by professional ties, because I feel we are also friends. There's a friendship, and it will be an honor for me to welcome him in Italy in less than 1 month for several academic activities in Rome, in Pisa, and in Parma. I'm also very much grateful to everyone who jointly with me organized this event today. So months ago, I had the idea to make a bridge, let's say, between two major experts of disaster law in my two countries, Professor De Guttry, my country of nationality, and Professor Guerra in the country of my heart. I always say Brazil, the country of my heart. But this event would not have been possible without the collaboration and work of several people, including, of course, Milena Salacino, então. So thanks to all. And last but not least, of course, let me say grazie mille to my compatriot, Professor Andrea De Guttry, who accepted our invitation and has just given a wonderful presentation through which we had the opportunity to learn a lot about a very concrete and urgent topic. And spero di poterla incontrare presto, professore. Sarebbe un piacere, naturalmente, conoscerla di persona e proseguire il dialogo su questi temi di interesse. Col professor Guerra, speriamo anche. So, as for my speech, I will be brief because I'm not an expert on disaster law, not at all. But they assigned me the role of discussant. So perhaps I cannot be a proper discussant, but I have to be a discussant, so I must discuss also the proposed thesis and arguments. And however, since I am trying to be a generalist scholar in the field of public international law, I will make some brief considerations and above all pose some questions that reflect simply the attitude of investigating each problem of international law, also the most technical ones, through the lenses of the general categories of the international legal order. So I have a big one big point and then more specific ones. So for the first of all, so by reading the material you shared with us, and in particular your comprehensive volume on the matter, and by listening to you now, I have often had the feeling, it's just a feeling perhaps, that the obligation of preparedness do not always possess a real obligatory character, an actual prescriptive content, the contenuto precettivo, we say, no, in Italian, but consists sometimes of, for sure, very, very important soft law directives. No? So my question is, am I wrong? I say this basically for two reasons. First of all, because alongside a thick web of treaties at universal, regional, and bilateral level, there is also a multitude of soft law instruments, as you said. For example, I'm thinking also at the Agenda for Sustainable Development, 2030. There is the SDG 3 that expressly refers to, I quote, early warning, risk reduction, and management of national global health risks, as an outcome to be reached by states. I'm also thinking in the context of the Americas, because here we are with Brazilian friends, about the plan of action that you quoted, of 2001, the third summit of the Americas, under which states are required to implement several preparedness measures, but it's a soft law instrument. But I'm saying this also, above all, based on the content of at least some obligations that we can find in the binding instruments. Because in some cases, it seems to me, I said I'm not an expert, so it seems to me, just a feeling, that the concrete contents are somewhat vague sometimes. And so this can pose perhaps the problem of an actually obligatory character. No? And also, this feeling is corroborated sometimes by the difficulty, at least for me, in clearly understanding how the remedies work. So let's consider, for example, the obligation to ensure the acquisition, use, and sharing of accurate data and other information. So apart from being somewhat vague, I don't know, I'm not an expert. It seems to me, I have this feeling, but it is not very clear to me towards whom exactly this obligation would exist. So towards, for example, all the states that are parties to a treaty. And moreover, in case of a breach of such an obligation, would it be necessary to establish a special interest of a state in order for it to claim judicially or also extrajudicially international responsibility? So, as I have devoted some effort to the study of international procedural law, I feel it would be interesting, perhaps, also to further research on the remedies for breaches of preparedness obligations. No? Okay, so to conclude on this part, I had this feeling that although there is a conspicuous series of treaties, many treaties, I read the chapters in your book, many instruments, binding instruments, but could we say perhaps that the soft law is still at the heart of this field? I have this feeling. I don't know. I have this feeling. And if yes, why? Why so much soft law in this field? So this was the first point. Now I have just a very few specific points. So one is always from the perspective of a generalist scholar, the possibility of reconstructing by interpretation one or a few general principles of international law in this field by derivation from this web of existing multilateral and bilateral treaties. So do you think this is an avenue? And also custom, international customary norm, you talked about in your presentation. And also in your writings, you have shown that there is a wide-ranging of generalized practice of states, as evidenced by the conclusion of multilateral or bilateral treaties across all continents. And also this the content of those obligations in these agreements overlap, overlaps in many cases. So due to the fact that also the ILC, as you said, refer to a widespread practice of state, how do you see the process of formation of a custom? Then I had another point on the lack of financial resources, but you already replied when you talked about the European Court of Human Rights, the margin of appreciation. So my point was, if structural shortcomings, conflict, international sanctions can exclude or mitigate states' international responsibility. And then another point, you didn't talk today in your presentation, but I found it in your book. It's very interesting when you wrote that there is sometimes a lack of distinction in many instruments between prevention and preparedness, and between preparedness and response. And you proposed an idea that I found very interesting, according to which it is crucial to divide the incident into phases, to identify who is responsible for each activity. So this, I think it's very relevant also for our projects here concerning disasters in Brazil, assessing the complexity of the attribution of competencies between federal and local authorities in the Brazilian legal order according to the Constitution. Okay, to conclude, just some three specific questions that relate to disasters in Brazil. So to one of them, probably you already replied, but I think it's an interesting point. In Lepadia, this year we are working on a research project on the disaster in Rio Grande do Sul of 2024, when severe floods devastated much of the state.
I cannot hear you anymore. I think you muted yourself.
I'm sorry. Till when you hear? Till when? Okay. I was talking about Rio Grande do Sul. Have you heard? So the disaster in Rio Grande do Sul is not a chemical, biological, or radionuclear incident. So my question is, but perhaps you already replied, but I think it's an interesting point for our audience. So whether, why, and to what extent the discipline that you illustrated and its rationale can be applied, or is it different from the preparedness to face other type of disasters? So, or I don't know, eventually there is a specific discipline for natural disaster. We can apply by analogy the one that you illustrated. And then another interesting second point, and then I concluded with the third one, always regarding the Rio Grande do Sul. I have found that Resolution 231 of 2012 of the General Assembly stressed the need to differentiate between rural and urban areas when designing and implementing preparedness strategies. So it seems to me that this is interesting to discuss for Brazil, for the disaster of Rio Grande do Sul, and also because there are the obligation that you talked about regarding infrastructure that it seems to me are very crucial in the context of Brazil and the preparedness strategy of Brazil. The very, very last point, and then I conclude, you talked about the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, the World Bank. Is this program, I don't know how to define it, relevant also for Brazil, for the disaster in Rio Grande do Sul? And thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments. Shall I reply or? Okay.
Please,
Thank you very much for your comments.
would you like to reply?
Again, thank you very much for your comments and for your questions. I try to go quickly through all of them as much as possible. Customary law, yes, personally, I'm convinced that we can say that nowadays, basing myself as well on the report of the International Law Commission, that there is a customary law rule which imposes on state the obligation of preparedness. Now, inevitably, as you better understand than me, the customary law is very generic, so they do not precise exactly what it means, and therefore I think that the combination of customary law rule and treaty will help very much to make clear the legal framework, what exactly has to be done by member states. So I think that by states, I think that the existence of the customary law rule is relevant for those states who are not very actively involved in international treaties, because in any case, although they do not want to ratify treaties, it's their right, they have to remember that there is a customary law, generic, but in any case, they have to do something. And in the other point of view, I think the custom international law is very relevant to stimulate states to be more active. So it's not only because there is a treaty, but there is as well a customary, so this should a little bit increase the commitment to fulfill them. I think that there is enough international practice which can confirm that there is a customary international law rule. The question of margin of appreciation, absolutely yes. If there are special situations like a war or another natural disaster, this will be taken into account, and states can direct the funding to different priorities in that very moment. I repeat, what is very important, according to the jurisprudence of the European Court, is that the decision is based on something which is very factual, on scientific data, and it can be proved that it was reasonable at that moment. So don't think that you can change just for the sake of changing, but you always have to keep in mind that you might have to prove that this was the only option you had and that it was a very good decision because the alternatives were even worse, and therefore you must try to anchor this decision to very specific data and possibly scientific data. The question of, I'm going in the other way around, the question of prevention, preparedness, and response. Yes, I think we made it clear in our book that it is nice to have this clear separation, but in fact, it is not possible to 100% separate, because many preparedness are almost prevention, and prevention without preparedness doesn't work, and response. So they are all closely linked, but I agree with you that it would be extremely important, especially in realities like Brazil, but the same applies to Italy, where we have quite a lot of competences of the local authorities to clarify who is responsible for what. And that there might be areas in which you are responsible for both prevention and mitigation, or only for recovery, but what is important, because otherwise the system would risk not to work. Now, the other questions, first of all, the relevance of the soft law. You're right, there are quite a lot of soft law instruments. I mean, I just presented one slide, but there are probably hundreds of soft law instruments. I mentioned why, according to me, it is very important. Now, why do we have so many soft law? Although we have as well many treaties, so it's not that there is a significant disproportion, but for sure we have more soft law instruments. I think for various reasons, and the most important for me is that CBRN is an area which is continuously evolving. The technical aspects are continuously evolving. What we say today is not valid anymore tomorrow, most probably. And therefore, through soft law, you can adapt more quickly. If you need to revise a convention or to change, good luck. I mean, then you may lose years without producing any concrete result. And therefore, sometimes the preference goes to the soft law as a tool which is much more flexible and can be adapted to the evolving situation. And in a moment in which technical aspects are evolving so quickly, I think it is a very important element. But I would say that I noticed that there is not significant imbalance in between soft law and hard law. Personally, I feel that hard law is pretty enough, obviously never enough, but I mean, that's not that we are significantly missing. Now, going back to the hard law, I see your argument, and I fully agree that sometimes the hard law rules or conventions are inevitably not very clearly drafted, because they are the result of compromises, of negotiation, and of you have to make happy everyone. Therefore, the phrasing is someone drafted in a manner to make everyone happy, although then the consequences are that we as international law, we don't know how to interpret them, or we have to invent something and to be very creative. This is right. It is almost inevitably in all international convention, but it is part of the game. And if you would like to have more partners on board who accept the convention, you have to consider their specific needs and their wishes, even sometimes at the cost of not having very clear-cut rules. But in the meantime, I think that the rules which clearly define which are the obligations and are drafted in a not too much vague manner are quite numerous. So I agree with you that sometimes there might be statements, yeah, but the way the wording is not really an obligation, it's a mere recommendation, it's a hope. That's true, but the number of those rules which are pretty clearly drafted, and it's clear that it's an obligation, and it's clear what this obligation are significant, and I have tried to summarize those who are clearer. And one big issue we had, for example, in Italy is that we have a health system which is working pretty well in normal circumstances, but we are not prepared to face situations like the one in COVID. And nowadays there is a long this after COVID, but not only, and looking to the potential consequences of the war in Ukraine and the follow-up, we are now working very much to try to better understand and to decide what does it mean that we have to be ready for major events with hundreds of thousands of people going to the hospital in the same day, not during the next 2 years, but in the same day due to a CBRN event, due to an attack, due to a natural disaster, which is more and more likely to appear. And I can tell you that it is quite interesting at the level of the European Union. There are significant efforts which are at the level of designing the new strategy, of finding the financial resources to adapt the health structure to these special events. Just for your curiosity, I'm sure that you are aware, but in Germany, for example, they are now investing huge amounts of money to move part of the hospitals under below, I mean, just to make sure that if there is a bombing, they can continue to work, which nobody thought about this 20 years ago, but now they understand that they have to look into what happened in Ukraine or in Gaza, that they have to consider that they must be ready to face the situation with new measures. The data collection, I agree with you. It is, for me, and based on my experience, it is really crucial, and everyone involved in this says we need to have precise data, disaggregated, if you want us to prepare a proper strategy to deal with the situation. Now, you're right. Who should receive this data, which should be collected in a standardized form and provided that so that they can be used. Now, it depends very much from the system, but for a certain number of cases, you have to provide this to the World Health Organization. This is very clearly regulated in the international health regulations. If this happens, you must provide this information to the World Health Organization, and they on this format and on the basis of this information. It doesn't always happen because sometimes states have a problem to fill in these forms because they don't have the disaggregated data. They may say, yes, we have 1,000 people who are suffering this, but they are not able to say how many females, how many old people, how many younger people, how many people with disability, whatever it is. So it is a big challenge, but everybody involved in this, I'm not involved in this, but everybody says we need, the more accurate these data are, the better it is. It's not only
Just one thing, sorry to interrupt now, because this example that you made about health made me clearly understand. So it's a very concrete obligation. Thanks to make this example, because it was very helpful. Yeah.
But as well in the European Union, the Center for Major Diseases, they have very, very clear rules. So, for example, as a EU member states, we have to notify certain situations to both the World Health Organization on the basis of the international health regulations and to the European Union because we are a member of the European Union. And they have defined very, very clear information. The problem is that we are not yet there to be able to collect all this information, especially disaggregated data. We are able to say, okay, today 1,000 people came with these symptoms in the different Italian hospitals, but then they say, okay, how many females, blah, blah, blah. We don't, it's a little bit more difficult. We are moving in this direction, but these are of fundamental importance. Now, the big issue is what happens if you do not communicate this. You are right. You would violate the international, both the obligations which are related to your participation to the World Health Organization, if you're a member of the World Health Organization, or of the European Union. You're right, the consequences are not clearly spelled out. You might consider that you will not receive assistance if you do not provide information on time. So the World Health System, you will not be in the priority list of those who will receive assistance because you have not provided data. It's a little bit more political consequences. They are not clearly spelled out concrete violations. If you do not do this, these are the consequences. No, we have to see them a little bit more in political terms, which is to a certain extent understandable. But I repeat, probably it would not be bad to have some very more concrete consequences clearly spelled out to stimulate states to implement what they have accepted as an international obligation. No state is obliged to ratify a treaty. If you ratify a treaty, please be consistent. You ratify because you would like to say to your public opinion, we are members of this fantastic treaty. Fantastic. Now be consistent. Implement it according to what is written in the treaty. Otherwise, you are not a serious partner of that given treaty. Now, finally, with the three more specific questions related to Rio Grande, you are right in saying that many of the rules which I have outlined are relevant for both CBRN and any kind of natural disaster. Not all of them. There are a few rules which are very specific to CBRN, especially those of notification, health issues and all this kind of stuff. They are very much related to CBRN, but many of the other rules are absolutely identical for any kind of natural disaster. And we notice this, that there start to be some cases of legal issues brought in front of the European courts of citizens who say my state has accepted this obligation, but they are not doing this, they are not implementing. And the court, obviously, sometimes they condemn, as you know better than me, the question of the environmental aspects and the right, I mean, the measures undertaken by states to reduce the emissions and so on. So to a significant extent, the rules are applicable to any kind of disaster. There are a few rules which are specifically devoted to severe event due to specific nature. Yes, it is true, the importance of, when you do the preparedness plan, to distinguish clearly in between rural and urban areas. That's a key element, but it is part of a preparedness plan, because obviously if there are 2 million of people living in that area, or if the people are the area is not densely populated, the measures you have to adopt are totally different. But it is a key element of a good preparedness plan to keep these differences and to have a look as well of the accessibility and so on. The last question, if the facility offered by the World Bank are available to Brazil, I have to admit I have no clear answer in this moment. I need to go back to study the issue. I really don't have the precise, I don't want to give you a wrong answer. So maybe yes, maybe no, I don't know. But it can be easily accessible, because all the facilities offered by the World Bank are easily accessible on the web. Sorry for not being able to answer more precisely that specific.
Thank you very much. So we are very lucky in having you here, because we are with this ongoing project on Rio Grande do Sul.
Yes.
So yes. I think that everybody of Lepadia is listening, and so we are probably. I took notes. You're helping us to further the research. Thank you very much.
Exactly. Well, thank you, Professor de Guthrie, once again, for your very insightful presentation, and also for your responses, which were equally as insightful. Thank you, Federico, for your participation and also your commentary. Now, I would like to, as our time comes to an end, I would like to call Professor Sidney to make his closing remarks. Please, Professor Sidney.
Thank you, Milena, again. Professor Andrea de Guthrie, grazie mille for your outstanding conference. I think that today we took the first step to build this important bridge between us, the Brazilian Academy and Italian Academy. I am so happy to receive you to this important conference to us. You are always welcome. And soon we'll be together personally in Italy. And thank you for it too. Well, as we come to the end of this section, I would like to thank you again, Professor Andrea de Guthrie, for his insightful and highly relevant contribution. I would like to thank Dr. Federico Travan and Milena Salatino for participation and discussions. Today's reflections highlights the complexity of CBRN risks and the need for more integrated and anticipatory approach within international law. It also reinforced the importance of moving beyond reactive frameworks towards more coordinated and preventive response to global risks. Once again, thank you, Professor de Guthrie, Professor Travan, and Milena Salatino. And thank you all for your attention and participation. I hope we can see you soon in another event. Thank you so much, and everything gets well. Thank you.